I think it's important, and I hope we can get back to this idea during the course of the rest of our hour at some point. It's important to understand the scriptures, which people think teach eternal torment, and to look at them closely and see what they're really saying and what they really mean. So that's something I want us to do a little bit later if we have time. 7 times in the Gospels, Jesus uses the phrase weeping and gnashing of teeth. And people picture someone in great torment and agony, grinding their teeth in pain, when in fact, if we use just a concordance for a moment and look at other places this phrase is found in the Bible, it doesn't mean that at all. But because gnashing of teeth throughout Scripture, in the Old Testament, in the book of Psalms, in the book of Job, elsewhere, and in the New Testament, a very famous example in Acts chapter 7, verse 54, when Stephen is being killed and stoned to death there by the unbelieving Jews, it says they rushed upon him, gnashing at him with their teeth. They're like wild animals. They're grinding their teeth in anger. And Jesus speaks of the wicked having weeping and gnashing of teeth when they're banished into hell. I think this is simply a picture of 2 reactions that there will be on the part of some. There's weeping, there's remorse, there's regret. They wish they had changed when they had opportunity. On the other hand, some are still defiant, and those are grinding at God with their teeth. And yet the Old Testament says that even as they grind their teeth, they vanish away and disappear into nothing. Because God's punishment is certain, God's punishment is eternal, God's punishment is absolute, is thorough, it's all-inclusive, and that's why Jesus says that God is able to destroy both soul and body in hell, and it's eternal punishment because they never come back again. Once destroyed, they're gone forever. But another figure that people think of is worm dying not, and the fire not quenched. I mentioned a moment ago this comes from Isaiah 66:24, but it's not a picture at all of people living with worms punishing them, eating on them while they're alive. Isaiah 66:24 says that the saved shall go out and look on the corpses of those whom the Lord has slain, where their worm dies not and the fire is not quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. It's a picture of people who have been killed and they're being devoured by maggots and eaten by fire, and it's disgusting, it's repulsive, it makes you sick at your stomach. That's not a literal picture at all, of course, but it's a picture of the Valley of Hinnom, this city dump outside Jerusalem. It's a picture of a horrible, disgusting end where people are treated like refuse. They're just garbage in the universe because they rejected God and the source of all life. And the fact of the matter is, John, this is so obviously clear to anybody who stops and thinks about it. No one can cut themselves off from God completely and entirely and continue long to exist. Just as if you take a coal out of the fireplace, it's going to soon lose all the fire that's in it, because God is the source of life. God only has immortality. Immortality for people is a gift of God through Jesus Christ. Otherwise, people are mortal, and when they die, they would stay dead if God didn't raise them. But He is going to raise them for judgment and for accountability, and then the wicked will be cast into hell, and they'll be destroyed and gone forever.
And Revelation 20 talks about the second death. I find it interesting, Hebrews 9:27, we're coming up to our bottom of the hour break. And as it is appointed once for man to die. Everybody that's born into this world, you're going to die, folks, bottom line. However, the second death in Revelation, you're not appointed to that. It's by your own choice. Going through the scripture passages, showing people the difference. You know, there's a passage that we talked about, as an Adam all dies and Christ also be made alive. But the point is, some to everlasting life, but some to everlasting condemnation. That seems to be the hang-up for people, because if life is everlasting here on the positive side with Jesus, then everlasting condemnation, isn't that the same? And I think that's where the problem is.
Well, and the people are correct who say that both sides are equally everlasting, of course. But the question is, when Jesus speaks of eternal condemnation or eternal judgment or eternal punishment, the question is, of what does this punishment consist? If we stop and just think about that for a moment, it's very clear that the word punishment itself doesn't tell us what punishment is. We can say if you speed in your car down the highway, you will suffer punishment. And we could say if you break in and rob a bank, you will suffer punishment. And we can say if you shoot somebody dead with premeditated murder, you'll suffer punishment. And yet the punishment in these different cases might be in one instance a fine, A punishment might simply be some time in jail. The punishment might be life in prison. Or in the worst case, punishment might mean capital punishment and someone is put to death. All of these are punishment. The word punishment doesn't tell us what it is. Punishment word simply means that this is the penal consequence of wrongdoing, which is pronounced on a person by a judge with authority. And so when God sentences some people to eternal punishment, that is a punishment from God, the righteous judge, but the punishment itself could be whatever God determines for the punishment to be. And in this case, when Jesus speaks of eternal punishment in Matthew 25, we know what he's talking about because Paul himself says in 2 Thessalonians 1 that when Jesus returns, he will punish with everlasting destruction or eternal destruction those who did not know God and didn't believe the gospel. So the problem here, and you were exactly on point a moment ago when you said the emphasis in the Bible is on life. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 16, Paul writes that God only has immortality. Immortality, of course, just means deathlessness, the state of never dying. God only has immortality. Human beings are mortal. Human beings depend on God for existence. There's nothing about us that is eternal by itself apart from God's gift. This is where the teaching of eternal conscious torment really came from. And when we go through church history, as I do in my book, The Fire That Consumes, we can see very clearly what happened, and that is that in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, some people came into the church who had been Greek philosophers. They're referred to as the apologists because they defended the Christian faith with arguments. But they brought with them from their Greek background the Socratic and Platonic teaching of the immortality of the soul. And the pagan Greeks believed that the body is just a prison house, and that inside the body is an immortal soul that is trapped in that body until we die, and then that soul goes back wherever souls came from. That's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that God made man out of dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils breath of life, and he became a living soul. We became souls. We don't have souls. But the pagan Greeks believed that the soul is immortal, and everybody has one, and it will always live, and the body is bad, and all of this kind of stuff. So what happened is these apologists brought that doctrine into the church with them. And when they did, it forced them to do this kind of reasoning. Tertullian is explaining what Jesus is teaching in Matthew 10:28. Fear God who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. And Tertullian says, now let's think about this. He explains from his point of view, the soul doesn't need saving because the soul is already inherently immortal. And so Jesus must be talking about saving the body only. Then he goes on and explains further, and he says in effect this idea. He says we must not think when Jesus says that God is able to destroy the soul, that the soul will cease to exist, because we all know that souls are immortal and cannot be destroyed. Well, that's just the opposite of what Jesus said. The Bible doesn't teach the immortality of human beings except as a gift of God. Every time, this is so important, but it's exactly the truth, and I want your listeners to look this up for themselves and see it in their own Bible. Every time the Bible uses the word immortal or immortality of human beings, three things are always true. It's always talking about the saved, never the lost. Number two, it's always talking about the body, never the soul without a body. And number three, it's always talking about in the resurrection. It's not talking about by creation. The Bible doesn't teach the immortality of the soul. It